Yeah,
are.
because we don't want to put you in on your last meeting.
That's right.
I say that I was fashionably late, or what was the other way?
Actually,
That's right.
he's got
Showed it.
3 seconds.
5:03.
1 second. He's here. He's here.
How are you?
I'm good. More or less.
All right,
So
I think we are going to call this meeting to order.
Kate, always give 10 per minute.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So yes, I don't have the same bag, so yes, please. Thank you so much. Okay, so the first item on the agenda is the approval of the agenda.
Move to approve the agenda as written.
A second?
Second.
I think all the motions should come from you two tonight.
Let's get them all in.
Go out in a flurry.
All right, so we have approved the agenda and we will move on to the third item
Take a
of
quick vote.
approval of minutes. I'm sorry.
We take a quick vote
Oh,
on that motion.
We
and
need a
second.
vote, sorry. Thank you. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? No. And now we have approved the agenda and we will move on to approval of the minutes. Anybody have any comments on the minutes?
I didn't see anything.
Motion to approve the mittens, the minutes as written.
Second.
Don't put that in the minutes, please.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? No. All right, so we've approved the minutes. Moving on to citizen comments on matters not on the agenda. Are there any citizens who would like to make a comment on matters not on the agenda? No? Okay. I'll close that item. And move on to new business, which is the annual zoning ordinance amendments for zoning order amendment 2023-01, accessory dwelling units or ADUs. So first, we will have the staff report. So Arnie, do you want to describe what we're going to be talking about and what your goals are for the evening?
You can indulge me. I'm going to talk a lot here about where we are and what we hope to accomplish, in the sense that we haven't talked about ADUs in a couple of meetings. We've had other things on our agendas. So I would like to do a quick review, because with the format that you have it in this evening, you have not seen before. We're following more of those elements that the AARP guide sort of had. And now we've placed all the items into more of an ordinance format, where we have the use matrix up front, then the use and design standards sort of in the middle, and then a couple of definitions that would be proposed to be added to the definitions section, which is all the way at the back end of the zoning ordinance. Also, perhaps to explain quickly, we did give you an appendix, and we'll get to that sort of as a little bit of presentation material once we get to the nonconformities. That's the section that we really haven't covered yet. So we've taken a first cut at everything on that list that came from the AARP guide, except for nonconformities. So there'll be some review materials, and then if we could get into nonconformities, and hopefully we can finish nonconformities, and that way we would have a sort of final draft, not final draft ready for presentation or public hearing advertisements yet, but at least a first cut of a draft. Then that we could go back and address all of the highlighted items, and there are quite a few.
Can I ask you a question? At what point we all received this email from you that was forwarded by you to all of us about that some comments Leslie had introduced regarding the purpose statement? is that gonna fall outside of what we're trying to accomplish here, or is that the kind of, is that gonna be something we should do?
For perhaps several reasons, I would ask that you either put that after this discussion, if we have time this evening, you would like to discuss the purpose statement and the proposal. I would like to get through as much as possible nonconformities, and Leslie's also not here. And by the time we go through this first draft, we will be revising or revisiting all the items again that are highlighted. And then we also have to bring up to speed 2 new planning commissioners at the next meeting. But if you, the 2 of you gentlemen in particular, have any parting words of wisdom or would like to talk about the purpose statement, I'll certainly give you, there will be that opportunity towards the end of this, because we would certainly like to know your thoughts about ADUs and any guidance that you want to provide as we go forward with this project.
And could they also provide some written comments
Absolutely.
if you wanted to?
100%.
If we don't get to whatever it is.
Can show up at the next meetings as comments to the public, from the public, all those things. Okay. Just to go quickly, again, I really don't want to necessarily spend too much time, but if you have burning questions, please ask. It looks like I forgot to number the pages, but if you go over to the use matrix, that's just to show, again, we're now trying to provide it to you in actual ordinance format, a format that follows the current zoning ordinance. The first time accessory dwelling units would show up would be in the use matrix, and that's in Article 3. And the way we have it right now is a conditional use for accessory detached dwelling units. And those would be conditional uses in the R1, R2, RM, and RLC zoning districts. And then going over to the next page in the use and design standards section, which is section 11 of the code, we would be bumping back chickens because we would go alphabetically, and accessory dwelling units would be the first item under that section. There's the purpose statement that if we have time, we can certainly get into towards the end of the meeting. Then the definitions, 2 definitions particular to this section would be located here. You'll also notice that the 2 definitions will be added to the definition section, which again is at the end of the zoning ordinance in Article 20. Then we get into the general standards that would apply to both detached and attached accessory dwelling units in subsection C there. And going over to D, then we have a couple that are particular to the attached accessory dwelling units. Subsection E is the list that we've really been working on a little bit more diligently with the use and design standards that would be for detached accessory units. And I actually should mention that the highlighted items in yellow are the things that we've sort of put placeholders in pretty much since the beginning of our review of accessory dwelling units. Those items that are in that cyan or bluish color that are highlighted are really the items that were added from your last meeting, just to distinguish the 2. And then flipping over to the page, subsection 9, again, trying to focus more on detached, non-conforming accessory buildings. These are not buildings that are new. In other words, there's already a process in place for accessory structures that will be new. We've already established at least placeholders for what the setbacks will be. There'll be a conditional use permit process for those as it's written now. And these are also not the illegal units. So there may be some accessory dwelling units in detached structures that exist currently that were never approved, may not fall into some of our rules and regulations. And that's a separate item also. What we're trying to focus on here are those structures that are non-conforming and will most likely be non-conforming with respect to setbacks. That would be, I presume, the situation that we encounter the most. So when we're talking about those non-conformities, one thing that I haven't done so well, and I'm going to read part of the first part of section 9 or subsection, detached non-conforming accessory buildings. And I put in the words with the exception of gazebos, because we had a fairly lengthy discussion about gazebos and other structures that may not have walls to them. So that's, again, a placeholder, something to review. Existing prior to whatever the date is of the adoption of this accessory dwelling unit section of the zoning ordinance may be altered to make interior alterations, whether structural or non-structural, in accordance with all the requirements of Article 16. I was just, I guess, not just hoping that you knew, but it was sort of dependent on the fact that you would know what was in Article 16. But that is the section that includes non-conforming standards for uses and for non-conforming structures. So instead of just making the assumption that you knew what was in there, and then we would go forward and add more things specific to detached accessory buildings, I thought it might be useful to quickly go through the standards that we have in Article 16, which is non-conforming uses and structures. And that's in your appendix. Not in your appendix like in your body, but the extra pieces of paper that we gave you. If you could flip over to the second to the last page or third to the last page. Again, this is existing zoning ordinance language and for non-conforming uses and structures. And I'm going to blow through this fairly quickly. And what we've highlighted there, what I asked Kate to highlight is every section that has anything to do with structure. So we do have non-conforming uses. We're not really so concerned about that at this point. So trying to focus just on where the Article 16 deals with non-conforming structures. I'm going to read that first section in the continuation. So if at the time of the enactment of this chapter or any subsequent amendment thereto, any legal activity is being pursued on any lot or structure legally utilized in a manner for or for a purpose which does not conform to the provisions of this chapter, such manner of use or purpose may be continued as herein provided. So if that two-car garage is on the back property line, that's fine. And if that was built prior to the adoption of the ordinance or prior to the adoption of the 5-foot rear yard setback for accessory structures, which I believe happened in 2017, then that two-car garage can continue to exist provided A through E. So A talks about a change in title or possession does not violate it. So just because you sell the property doesn't mean the garage has to be moved or come down. B, if any non-conforming use structure activities discontinue for a period of 2 years, then you lose the ability to have that. So that's, you're familiar with that provision, and that 2-year time frame also comes into play for a couple other things, such as conditional use permits and whatnot. So that's not unusual. C, a non-conforming structure, lot, or use may be changed only to another use of a substantially similar character as the original use or to a more restrictive use. That structure cannot be made worse. In other words, and it gets a little bit confusing on uses. You can make it to another use that's substantially similar, but not worse. But we're trying to focus more on structures than uses.
So can I ask a
Mhm.
question? So if we're talking about to another use of substantially similar, so would an ADU be considered substantially similar to a garage?
I think when we write subsection 9 in the accessory dwelling units, then we're going to specify, and it will be clear that in those cases where we have a non-conforming structure, that putting in an accessory dwelling unit, because we specifically allowed it with use standards, then yes, that would meet the requirements of it being substantially similar. So there is that specific provision that would allow that change.
But we can set setback standards.
So, yeah, correct. We still have the ability to make those
Okay.
minor detailed adjustments in subsection 9, where we talk about nonconformities.
Okay. Thanks.
Is there a question?
Yeah, but I want to make sure you get through all of the A, B, C, D, E before I ask the question.
Okay. D, whenever a nonconforming structure or activity has been changed to a more limited nonconforming use, such as maybe exchanged only to an even more limited. Again, this is more about uses. I don't have a good example, but if you had a use in a structure and you can continue with that use or something that is similar to that, or one that has even more limited use, and that gets really subjective on how that gets handled. But again, if we have a specific provision for accessory dwellings to go into these structures, then I think we're covered. And then E doesn't talk about structures at all. So we read them. So any question there?
So 2 questions. If there's a non-conforming structure and I buy the property and it's non-conforming structures on there, and let's say it's a garage right next to an easement of an alleyway, and I don't use the garage for 2 years. And then all of a sudden I want to use it. Does that mean it's no longer non-conforming in an acceptable way? And that it ultimately, if you don't use it for, or if a property, let's say it takes 2 years to sell the property
Mhm.
and nobody lived in the house for 2 years. So clearly that garage has not been used by anybody. So does that mean that all of a sudden in B, you lose any ability?
For all practical purposes, we're not going to have such a microscope on that property to know. And unless the neighbor makes a deal of it and reports it and says, hey, that garage is non-conforming and they haven't used it as a garage. And then somebody would have to prove that they have or haven't used it. So that's a difficult sort of enforcement item, but we would be fairly liberal, I think, in the application of that. Because as long as a garage doesn't necessarily only house a car, so as long as you had some yard tools are in it or something, I think we'd be fairly liberal in the application.
Okay. And the second thing, the non-conforming structure, this is gonna get back to the gazebo. So I have a gazebo. Is there more limited use if I transform that gazebo? I wall it in and make a nice little small accessory dwelling? And it fits all the other criteria. What is a more limited? I don't know.
Again, with the uses, I think as long as we say in the section about nonconformities for accessory dwellings that are detached, if we say this use, which is again is accessory dwelling use, is allowed in these nonconforming structures, I don't think we necessarily have to go and list all the nonconforming structures, but it's okay as long as it meets all the rest of the criteria that we put forward. So I think we cover ourselves by saying specifically in that section that the accessory dwelling use is acceptable in that non-conforming structure.
Yeah, I just want to make sure that we understand what a more limited use is, because it's not clear to me. That is, yeah, some people could claim, yeah, that's more limited use than, but you're right. We probably will address that earlier.
We will specifically
Yeah,
have, and even if now that we know this, and maybe it's good that we review this, that we say something in the accessory dwelling unit section that says, and this does not violate section 16-1.1- B or C, then it's really clear. Maybe that's a worthwhile exercise to do. There's nothing in prior building permits or certificate of occupancies. Going down to 16.4, changes in district boundaries. Whenever the boundaries of a district are changed, any uses of land or buildings which become non-conforming as a result, change shall be subject to the provisions of this article. So if it just said that means it becomes a non-conforming structure, and therefore it has to abide by all the stuff in this section. So nothing too terribly
And
difficult there.
this is going back to when we reviewed all the zoning, what was zoned what? Is that the same? Is that what this is addressing? If we suddenly come in as planning commission and decide we need to move these lines and make what was RLC, C1 or C2, then if you're now non-conforming, you're okay.
Yeah, and
Yeah,
I think that's what it's
is that
saying,
what
but it
that
would be
is?
probably be the opposite way of you said, because in C1, there are no setbacks.
Okay.
So if it went from that district to one that all of a sudden had a 10-foot rear yard and your shed is in the 5-foot or the 0, then that action makes the building non-conforming. But it's saying in that case,
Okay.
these regulations still apply to that nonconformity. 16.6 on the next page, a non-conforming structure shall not be extended or enlarged. That's a pretty basic provision for non-conformities. These are things that exist either in use or in structure, and we shouldn't be making them worse by making them into a more intensive use or extending or enlarging their physical footprint. Again, they shall not be extended or enlarged. And then B, a non-conforming activity may be extended throughout any part of a structure which was arranged or designed for such activity at the time of passage or amendment of the structure. I cannot come up with a good example of that, but if you had perhaps horse stall on the back of your property, and we've had those in the past. And it was built for 6 horses and you only use 2 stalls, then you could go back to 6 stalls and use them because that was what the structure was originally designed for, and that was the activity. I don't think we're gonna have too many of those instances. Major restoration, you always have to have a section that says if it was destroyed by acts of nature and other things, how are you limited or not limited to restoring that structure or use? As an example, in B, where a non-conforming structure devoted to a non-conforming activity or where a non-conforming structure is damaged to less than 50% of the cost of reconstructing the entire structure, either it may be repaired or restored, provided any such repair or restoration is started within 12 months. So that says if it's less than 50% of the value, then within 12 months, you have the ability to restore it back into the condition before whatever it is that damaged it.
I have a quick question about that, hopefully quick. So what if it's not completed within 18 months? There's another instance of this on 16.2 prior building permits, provided that such building is completed within 1 year. Like, what happens if it's not?
And then in theory, you would not be allowed to finish reconstructing it if you've started, or if you haven't started, then you just don't get to reconstruct. But we would also, the other part to add to that, that's what it says here. But in a lot of times with the building permit, as long as somebody's making progress, we give them leeway. And that's building permit, and that's separate from the language that we have here. So there would be some interpretation. If somebody's within like they get to 18 months and they only have a month's worth of work left, we would probably give them the leeway to finish that item. But if they make absolutely no progress, haven't gotten a building permit or anything, then no, we're not going to allow them in the 19th month to come in for a building permit.
Right. I'm sort of thinking about the kinds of delays that we saw during the pandemic in terms of getting building materials.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, obviously there are extenuating circumstances. I just, it's not clear to me when you've got a hard end date, whether I assume that that's just a subjective decision.
Yeah. I've gotten in trouble before for subjectiveness, but I would say that this is in writing, but we would provide leeway as needed on a case by case basis. You bring up a good example in the pandemic. In other situations, as an example, but not down to the building permit level, but the crash in 07, 08, and also in the pandemic, the legislature did extend some deadlines. So a subdivision would be valid, a subdivision approval would be valid for 2 years. And they said, well, during this period of time, it's now valid for 5 years because people weren't building during the bust cycle or during the pandemic. So there have been adjustments made at the state level for code at subdivision, but I don't think they came all the way down to this sort of nonconformity or building permit level, but adjustments have been made, I guess is my point.
Okay. Yeah,
And
But-
we
but
don't,
this would be relevant to ADUs potentially.
and we don't touch this if it's a historical something. Like we had that, the house that burned down, I think it was on Randolph, that, and then they lay dormant for a long time. It far exceeded these limits, but I think it was historical. So we didn't have to, we have to get involved in that. I don't remember.
No, in the sense that that's in the residential historic district, they have to go before the ARB, and that's actually in my zoning report that they filed an application to get a certificate of appropriateness for demolition of that structure. That structure was non-conforming in the sense that it had too many units in it. It's in an R1 zoning district. So in theory, not in theory, but by application of the code, they could have a 2-family dwelling at most, and they had 6 units in there. They were not able to get a building permit within a 2-year period. So that's a good example of where they were not able to get a permit within 2 years, even with a little bit of help and cajoling from a building official. So they lost the right to do the 6 units in that building. and now have the right to do a two-family dwelling, and there are two parcels there. So two-family dwelling and the two-family dwelling on the parcel towards the rear. So that's a good example of where that 2-year period was applied.
So that's helpful. It was a good question because I had the same one and it helped me understand it better. Because I was trying to understand if an ADU, take it back to an ADU, was destroyed or damaged in a storm, then if they did nothing for 18 months, just left it in a heap, what would that mean? That they couldn't?
Well, you'll see that 50%, depending on if it's 50% or if it's
Right.
more then we have the two regulations here. But if you're saying if they did absolutely nothing in the 18-month period, made no attempt to contact us, did nothing, then they could rebuild the ADU, but in compliance with the code, which would then mean the current setbacks would be applied. So potentially they would, if it's on the property line at the rear of the property, they would have to reconstruct it in such a way that it would be 5 feet in. So we have that portion that was just read about 50% less than, or the replacement cost is less than 50% of the cost of the value of the unit. And then in D, I think this is the section that talks about acts of God. If it's destroyed by fire, natural disaster, or other acts of God, then it can be. But also further down, it actually has some time frames on it as well. 2 years or replaced
Okay.
within 2 years, the day of the natural disaster, act of God. And then at the last part, you can't light the thing on fire and then claim an act of God. So you cannot be the cause or the act itself. So that's generally what we have in our non-conforming sections. In the last section on the last page, 16.8 non-conforming lots. Again, this is more about lots, but I'll read it anyway. Any lot of record at the time of adoption or amendment of this chapter, which is less in area or in width than the minimum required by this chapter, may be used or built upon, provided that a variance of yard and or setback requirements, if required, is obtained by the BZA. So the big takeaway, I think, is simply if you have something that's non-conforming, it doesn't matter if it's a structure or a use, you can't make it worse. It's there. It existed at the time of the zoning ordinance, or it's before some change in the zoning ordinance, and it's okay to continue with it, but you can't make that use or structure any worse with, in this case, or in our examples, with respect to the setbacks. And then there are some rules and regulations that if you do have damage, how does that get addressed? And there are some time frames.
And when you say worse, do you mean more non-conforming?
Correct. It wasn't very specific, but that's correct.
Arnie, I have a question for 16.6 extensions or enlargements. In a hypothetical example of somebody having a non-conforming accessory dwelling and they wanted to add like an exterior deck or carport or some sort of awning that is extending from the exterior wall, is that considered an enlargement? Or if it's not changing the floor plan, the floor footprint?
It is. It's if that thing required a building permit, and the awning would, potentially, depending on how it's structured. And so I'm going to give you an example. If it's the rear yard, so you're the rear property line and you have this structure and it's 40 feet in width and it's up against the property line. So it's supposed to be 5 feet in, but so 40 feet. Now your awning and other addition can be placed internal on the internal side, no problem. But any additional encroachment into that 5-foot setback above the 40 feet, it's already encroaching for 40 feet. So if you put the awning on the side and all of a sudden it's now 46 feet because the awning's 6 feet in width, that can't happen because you're not supposed to be building anything new in that setback. So you're grandfathered for what you've got, but you can't make the nonconformity worse by adding extra footage to that 40 feet that's already in the setback.
Okay, so it's just the act of making it worse, and not just, you just can't make any extension of the dwelling, even if it's not, even if you're going the other direction towards the house, towards the original primary house, like, which it's not encroaching more, but like you could do that because it's not making it worse. Okay.
Right. Unless we start putting some maximum sizes on it, but that's a little bit different. But Here, the encroachment into that setback, that is the nonconformity. I would take it a little bit further, and my interpretation has been that if you have a one-story structure, doesn't matter if it's a garage or what it is, and it's up against the property line, you cannot, if you want to stack a second story onto that for the garage apartment, as an example, it would have to be set 5 feet in from the property line, because your nonconformity is 5 feet in for 40 feet in length along the property, but it's only for a one-story encroachment. You can't then just layer on extra stories into that setback. That newer section would have to be, and it's going to be a little bit odd looking, and architects probably would hate that, but there are ways to handle that when a design perspective. But that new thing, again, can't go into the yard or even necessarily get stacked on top for extra volume in that setback area.
Thanks.
Any other questions about section or Article 16? Sorry, that was a fairly quick overview of nonconformities, but hopefully that gives you a little bit better understanding. And I was perhaps making too many assumptions when I said, Article 16, that stuff about nonconformities.
Well, it was helpful. Thank you.
Can I just do one thing that's bugging me a little bit, and I may be totally off. On D, it says disaster, destroyed by fire, natural disaster, or other act of God. Should be another act of God or other acts of God.
I don't know, but this is, I think, fairly standard language from the state.
Okay,
I believe
that's fine.
so.
It was okay.
Okay, if we're, if you can go back, if you don't mind, to, actually, I should just follow up. Second to last page, again, subsection 9, where we still have some work to do on detached non-conforming accessory buildings. Again, we added in gazebos just as a placeholder because there was that discussion about gazebos, and I was thinking about carports also after the meeting. I'm just thinking that's the same sort of situation where you have posts and you don't have infill walls. And the question here is, can you infill the walls? And that strike interior came from our last meeting also, just the sense of not just being limited to changing interior walls. And then going down now 1 through 8 or 9, and hopefully to get at least through number 5. The first item there is a review. At the last meeting, we discussed if this, okay, I should back up a half a step. Sorry. We have some limitations on sizes for accessory detached units. They can only be 40% or 800 square feet as an example. If there's 4-car garage exists on the property line, how much of that could be utilized? It seemed to be the consensus at the time or general agreement that there should be no maximum square footage placed on that. So if that, with some reservations about setbacks, there was, at least as a placeholder for now, the sense that if that structure was already there, it was non-conforming, that more than 800 square feet. So more than if you built a new one could potentially go in.
Are we still beholden to the idea that the accessory dwelling cannot be larger than the primary structure? So that was a,
when the rest of us come back to this and review all of it sort of,
yeah,
and then I think we'll have to put more sort of detail on that.
yeah.
But what I heard at the last meeting was, and we had some discussion through there about the attached units and new units, and maybe they are a certain percentage of, but maybe there isn't a maximum for those. In other words, they're just based on the percentage of the main unit. But here it was just, I think, a flat, if that structure is bigger than 800 square feet, whatever it ends up being, even if it's twice as big as 800 square feet. At the last meeting, it seemed like you were comfortable with saying that there's no maximum square footage and no tie back to a percentage of any other unit size.
Although Blake, you've made a very good observation there, that you could, in fact, if you had a very large garage and a very small house, you could end up having a much larger
Mm.
accessory dwelling unit.
It's a good question and it's something that we should certainly keep in mind. I don't think we're going to come across that often. I mean, that's going to be a rarity in this town from what I gather. If we're
I'm going back to trying to find where the language was that something shall not exceed 50%.
Yeah.
It's like section 10 of section C of general standards, but is that something that we still are, we still left in though? Is that the main standard is that an accessory dwelling can't be larger than 50% of the primary?
we still have, and I can't find it quickly either since we have a new format.
Was it-
E1 as an example, in this, well, D1 and E1, I think is where we're picking up. So
Okay.
D1 is accessory dwelling units and attached structures. The gross floor area may not exceed 40% of the gross floor area of the principal structure. And again, I'm talking about attached units, nor more than 750 square feet. And that's some highlighting there from that last discussion about striking the overall cap, because we may have larger structures, and that might be what you're recalling. And then in E for detached standards, the gross floor area of a detached accessory unit may not exceed 40% of the gross floor area of the primary dwelling on the property, nor more than 800, a total of 800 square feet. So you're right. If we're talking in 9.1 about maximums, are we tying it back? And what I heard, I believe what I heard at the last meeting was no, if it's 1,000 square feet or 1,600 square feet, it seemed to be fine. Again, this is a placeholder, as you can tell from the highlighting, and that can be revisited.
So this is, in that case, we're speaking of an existing non-conforming structure.
Correct. And it's sometimes hard to, because we're jumping around perhaps a little bit, but we have the structures in structures, accessory dwelling units inside an existing structure. We have new potential accessory dwelling units. They're going to have to be built to the standards with setbacks and the sizes that we talked about. And now we're talking about those oddities or nonconformities where you have a structure that doesn't comply with setbacks, maybe height, maybe some other issues. And how do we deal with those? So we are dealing with the oddities of the nonconformities now.
Yeah, again, it's possible that I'm thinking of hypotheticals that don't exist in Lexington. And so it's,
As a zoning administrator, I appreciate, because when it does come across and we do have direction, if specific direction needs to be put in this section, then I always like to have it as opposed to having to make a determination. So I'm not sure if you want to talk about that now, as far as, do you want to do something else with the maximum square footage by tying it to some sort of percentage or other maximum?
if this is something that other planning commissioners felt strongly about, that the whole point is we don't want to create Frankenstein accessory dwelling units that dwarf the primary structure, then maybe this is also a spot where we could put that, like, no maximum square footage as long as it doesn't exceed the size of the primary structure, something like that. If that's only if people care about it, I'm not going to die on this hill of non-conforming structures, which there may not be any inventory in Lexington.
Yeah, I just would like some clarity in D1 and E1. One says 750, the other one says 800 square feet.
So one's attached and one's detached.
One's, okay,
D is attached.
okay, thank you.
That was intentional at that time.
Yeah, it was.
And in those same two, it says 40% of the gross floor area. Is that the footprint, or is that like if I have a 3-story house and each one is 1,000
It's
feet,
your
that's
square footage total. Yes.
That's what's.
I'd like to go back to Blake's
Yeah.
point. I I would agree with Blake, and it's not because this is his last meeting.
sure.
First time you finally agree, huh?
No, I-
Grudgingly agree.
I think we do need to, I'm uncomfortable with no maximum square footage.
How about we add that?
Yeah.
How about we
I
add
same
something
here.
to the effect, as long as it does not exceed the square footage of the main structure?
Mhm.
No.
That seems kind of
Yeah, what a,
extraordinary. So in other words, if you have the land that will allow you to build this whole another house.
No, we're not building. This is non-conforming.
Okay, okay.
You have an 800 square foot house, you have a 1,600 square foot barn structure out back. You would be allowed to put an accessory dwelling unit in it with a conditional use permit, but you can only utilize 800 square feet of that barn for the
I can
accessory dwelling.
understand that. Okay, yeah, I can.
Good example.
Okay, that's good. Yeah, that's, I like that.
And then last time also, number 2, any entrance to an ADU located on an alley must be at least 5 feet from the property line adjacent to the alley. I believe that was largely for security concerns. We don't necessarily need to revisit it unless you have any questions. And then on interior lots. So now we're talking about interior lots, corner lots, and then also interior lots that are adjacent to an alley. We tried at the last minute to provide you with some visuals
especially for Matt.
because
Okay.
Matt said in the last meeting he loved Legos.
Well, makes sense.
Thank you.
So in your
Present.
appendix, in the appendices, you have this drawing that's in the definition section that just gives you sort of a quick overview of corner lots, what a corner lot is, interior lot, double frontage lot. And then we try to provide you with real world examples, but not without providing you too much information. As an example, on page 3, an interior lot that happens to be at 108 Moore Street, R1 zoning district, has a 15-foot front yard setback in the R1 zoning district, 10 foot on the sides, and a 5-foot rear setback. So if we had a structure in the rear yard that is up against the property line, are we okay with that? And we struggled a little bit, I think, because we may have been not having the same thing in all of our minds with respect to what is 5 feet for the rear, 10 foot for the sides. Do we allow some flexibility for these non-conforming structures? How much flexibility? And in hopes of sort of clarifying that or giving you a little bit more to sort of see how that might happen, Kate spent some time, and that's why we don't have a lot of agendas, because I ate up her time and late in the afternoon. We tried to provide you with a visual.
Whoa, this is multimedia presentation.
yes,
Oh,
3D.
thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Wow, look at that.
I really appreciate
So
this.
this is the same thing that you have. So Moore Street up at the top, this is actually the footprint of the house, but that's the house.
Built out of Legos.
That's the-
Wow.
So you have a house up front, interior lot, lots on the back side, lots on the side, no alleyway to this. And then let's say you had an accessory structure of some sort that's on the property. That's allowed now.
Yeah.
Not taking it.
Yeah, I'm gonna trim this.
So how much of allowance do we want? We need to think about rear yard setbacks, and we need to think about side yard setbacks in this example. I don't know if this is going to help, but I'm hoping it does.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So we
helps.
have a house again. It's within the setbacks. Heck, it might even be over like this house currently is. That's what the footprint of the house is. That's not a problem. We're not talking about that. We're talking about the accessory that's in the back. And let's say it's in the center and it happens to be on the property line. Does it matter how big it is? In other words, it's okay if you get up to a certain size. We also talked about if the accessory structure is certain number of feet away from other structures, mainly main structures, main residences. If it's 20 feet, then maybe it's okay. If that other structure, main structure residence is closer than that, then you can't can't convert the nonconformity into an accessory dwelling. So I'm just hoping to tease out of you how much flexibility, or is there no flexibility? Because that is an option. At least one of our examples said that they can only go into structures that are 100% conforming with current zoning standards. So that means anything that's on the property line or non-conforming with respect to setbacks could not be utilized. So you could go to that extent. I think we've sort of decided over time that it would be okay to provide flexibility We just got to figure out how much flexibility.
So in order for this to be in compliance, it would have to be there, correct?
Correct.
With current,
Roughly, yes.
5 feet from the back, 10 feet from the side. So technically, if we had no setbacks, this could be smack on the corner and it could impact 3 other properties.
True.
And I know that one of the items that we had talked about was that you could put in an ADU so long as there were no windows on up against a property line. But then having a dwelling unit with no windows on 2 sides seems dangerous in terms of fire. And I don't know what the fire code would have to say about that.
I don't have the answer to that for fire code purposes tonight, but whatever they will have to have a building permit certainly, because if it transitions to a dwelling unit, it's going to have a building permit and it's going to have to meet building code requirements.
So, well, certainly we shouldn't allow, or we shouldn't restrict access to, an entire side if that goes against fire code. Because then nobody would be able to do anything with that. So I guess I would still go with the 5 foot setback. I guess I would go 5 feet from the back and 5 feet from the side on an interior lot. That would be where I would.
I'm very nervous about possible implications to all the property around it by allowing it to be residential right on the property line side.
I got a question, which is just general building or zoning are people allowed to build fences on the lot line?
Correct. We have a couple of provisions or allowances in our code that you can't build a structure in the setback, and there's exceptions for fences, walls, and a couple of other things. And then we had those more limited encroachments that we allowed a couple of years ago.
Like gardens and raised beds. I guess I'm just like, if somebody put their structure was right on the lot line, that would prevent a neighbor from building a fence in that spot, because it would be.
It would, the neighbor could put the fence 6 inches in potentially, and we'd have to worry about fire code. But other than that, they could still put their fence. It might not be able to be on the property line because this thing is already on the property line, but they still have the ability to put a fence in that setback.
But they would have to, their fence would have to encroach on their property, even if it's just 6 inches, right? So if this neighbor had a house that was right here, and these 2 neighbors that are catty corner wanted to put up fences, each of them would have to pull their fence in onto their property, so that seems like unfair to those neighbors. Also, who would win? And would the fire code prevent them putting a fence up against somebody else's window? Like you don't want to set up a scenario where the party that's not actually trying to take an action gets disadvantaged.
True. So we're trying to figure out if the structure is already there, can it or can it not? And I would ask that you maybe not get too into the fire code, because I don't have the answers for those. So just sort of more philosophically, can it or can it? And then we'll have to certainly work the details on fire code and building codes and that type of thing.
So this has been a consistent debate among us. And I think Pat made a very cogent argument the last time he was here that we needed to find a little bit more flexibility, and using the one case that we have that's been brought forward as an example. So I'm trying to find a way and encourage Arnie to follow his thinking on this to provide some more flexibility. And but Shannon, to also, not but, and to somehow account for your notion of the adjoining uses and not impacting them. I don't think we're there yet. And in the context of Lexington in particular, we have a lot of, I don't know how many. I'm a case in one, but I know of many, I've seen others where the old garages are built right on the lot line or definitely within 5 feet. So in my case, that would be one that I could, could I do an ADU in there? And and I'm not planning to, so I'm not an example for someone who wants to do it. And I think I'm just trying to think about how can we do it to ensure that the adjoining users are not penalized. Adjoining property owners are not penalized.
Yeah, that's my.
It's critical to me.
Are there any placeholders that we could put in right now for interior lots? It's can encroach up to 5 in an R1 zoning district, up to 5 feet, maybe maximum in a side.
What is your question, Arnie? Are we what?
I'm trying to see if we can't put some placeholders in
Language in
for what
the-
we're talking about now. Shannon mentioned specifically that maybe that would be okay, and that being, sorry,
Yeah,
that if you went the 10-foot side yard setback, which is the green line, is it okay if this thing was no closer than 5 feet from the side property line? So a little bit of allowance where the new thing would have to be 10 feet from the side property line. But if the structure was as close as 5 feet, would that be okay to put an accessory dwelling unit? There's some flexibility on the side, but I've heard so far none.
Well, I think you made it click again in my head that these structures are already there and when you keep saying, is it okay to put in something here? We're like, nobody's actually putting in a structure.
Being use, sorry.
Right. We're putting in the use. So it's like, exactly. So that garage, that shed, that whatever is already there. So it's already has been encroaching on the lot line for as long as it's is that and the neighbors bought all that stuff. So is it just now okay for somebody to live there? So
Right. So putting that in terms of this is if it's already here, is it okay if people move in to this structure, if it's 5 feet away versus is it okay if they move in when it's back here or in the corner? Is it okay to have somebody living in there all of a sudden? And I mean,
So the imagination is that, let's say that's the main house, and then there's a driveway leading up the garage, which has always been here.
Mhm.
And can you now just say?
he made a car.
Oh, look at that. That's a small garage. You gotta rescale your garage. That is beautiful. Holy cow. Well, that is kind of what Pat and I think Blake. was
Well, yeah, I
asking
guess,
about that
yeah, it's
scenario. That's
obviously we can, it's easy, it's much easier to code in that we want to have setbacks when on any brand new structure, but it's sort of just the idea of somebody already has a garage, it's always encroached on the neighbor's property, and now you're just letting a tenant live there. Or
there's a
two
big
tenants.
difference though, in a garage and somebody living there.
yeah.
Yeah, it's, but the difference of
There's a
5 feet,
garage close to me.
the difference of 5
probably
feet
me,
though.
But
well, it's 5 feet versus no feet.
Well, right, yeah, because I'm saying like, so it sounds like you said it would be okay, 5 feet would be good. So like, it's okay if there's somebody sleeping 5 feet away, but the 5 feet over here, that's not cool. Like that's my wingspan.
yeah.
That's what we're talking about.
Yeah, and it's about your sense of your property and your land and kind of what do I envision my backyard to be? Am I going to have to pay attention to the fact that there's somebody living in the house next to mine? So maybe I won't put a garden back there, or maybe I won't have this otherwise legal application. Yeah, that makes me nervous to allow it right on the property line. I mean, I understand what you're saying, but and it seems like it's not trivial, but it's
Does it help at all to
Or sure.
work on some of the design details such as if there's a structure there that is on the setback line, it could only be utilized for an accessory dwelling unit if it doesn't have windows on that side, that it's zero lot line. I'm trying to figure out up to what point is it or isn't it? So I'm just playing with some different ideas, or if it's on the property line, it's a no-go.
I mean, for me, the lack of windows makes it work. If it's already, I mean, if it's already there, that does actually address that concern for me.
I don't think that'll work though, Shannon, because of the code.
The fire code, right,
Yeah,
but
it's not
So
gonna work.
it's possible.
so that wouldn't go against fire code to have, oh. Right,
Right.
It seems like a fair compromise to kind of.
Yeah.
Get around the privacy issue, which is what it really is boiling down to, is privacy. And I mean, because the structure has always been there, so it is always encroached, but now it's just the privacy of a person living there while you're mowing the grass or you're whatever.
So no windows. I think last time, if I remember correctly, we also talked about AC units or condensing units, or I can't remember else what we talked about that potentially couldn't be on that side. Anything else that y'all want to add?
On that side, you mean in the way that we have it laid out right there, that means no windows on the back or the side of the house, and the AC could not come out this way. It would have to go on the roof or maybe. Yeah, okay.
and how about roof overhangs?
If the overhang is already encroaching over the property line, I don't really see how we can cut the roof overhang off.
But you couldn't like change it in any way, right?
Shouldn't be able to change it in any way. You should, I mean, if they wanted to take a 12-inch overhang and cut it back to 6 inches, which makes it less non-conforming, then that's fine.
Sure.
But nothing again that makes it worse.
Okay.
So is that a good place? I'm asking. Is that a good
Yeah.
placeholder for now, that it
Yes.
can be on the property line? As long as it doesn't have windows or I don't want to say the word egress, doorways or windows. Fenestration, which is any openings that could be a window or a door.
But also not a,
Fenestration,
no penetration,
Fenestration.
fenestration,
fenestration.
no
Fancy word,
fenestration.
Openings in the
Great.
opening of the walls, fenestration.
Fenestration.
Okay, so no fenestrations of any sort, nor any AC units or anything that would encroach above the property line. Right?
I'm gonna complicate this a little bit.
Uh-oh.
Because let's say on the side, you have a 10-foot setback. Now that you're 5 foot in, let's say it's 5 foot from the side yard setback. Can you have fenestration at 5 feet?
I would be okay with that.
Sorry, I don't have windows. I have a door.
And where again, are we not allowing windows?
If it's on the property line. in this
Right.
Case, it's on the back property line and the side property line. So you would not be able to have a window or door here or on this side. Now I'm trying to figure out if we're in a little bit,
Yeah,
then you can have.
I don't know how you're gonna have a house with self and bedrooms without windows.
You'd have to have them on a different side.
We're down to,
Well,
I think it can be done in design, depending on how big the building is. If you even have a bedroom, or if it's a studio, and I think there's ways in the
Skylight.
design process to address those. And if you can't address those, then you just can't get a building permit.
so what you're saying there, we would, in the way that you have it laid out, we are allowing a window on the back, but now we're deciding if we want to allow it on the side, even though it's within the setback.
If it was.
If it's like that,
the property line, then no.
nothing.
But how far in before you're okay with it?
Well, if it's at the 5 feet from the back, then it can't have a window. But so what we're talking about is on the side. Okay.
But this time we're okay on the back,
Hmm.
but now I'm just wondering about flexibility on the side. The car back.
Wow.
I think what we just need to determine how many feet away from a property line can there be a window where somebody's living?
Right.
5 feet,
Yeah.
10 feet? 2 arms lengths? I mean, these are all accessory dwellings, so I mean, like. It's the name of the idea is that. We're intentionally allowing people to live in accessory structures. Cause the city is cool with that.
And this is for existing structures. It's not like somebody's come and play a game and build a. Okay, yeah,
I would hope, I'm hopeful that we can at least put some placeholders
Yeah.
in.
Yeah.
Is at the next meeting, sorry fellas, we can actually utilize some of the listed examples that we have. We had a short list of maybe 12 or so properties with accessory structures, and then we go by and say, hey, if it's at 5 feet, is the window okay in this case or in that case? So we can sort of not codify, we can sort of calibrate what we have.
So how are we feeling about the 5 feet?
I'd rather see more.
You'd rather see more? John, do you have any thoughts?
I'm all right with 5 feet. I'm
yeah.
remembering I looked at a friend's ADU in Tacoma Park, Maryland, and they had on the property line, and I wish I'd taken better pictures, but it was within 5 feet. I'm gonna go back and look. Because I think, again, it depends on how that side of the ADU is designed so that it's encroaching or not. And I think a key phrase that Blake said, you're really going out strong, Blake. is
Well, I
that-
just feel like we had this discussion.
Yeah.
You reminded me, like,
Yeah,
Pat and Leslie we already talked about this issue, so.
yeah, but that goes back to the privacy issue, which is also Shannon. So somehow finding the magic spot there.
So it seems like no doors. Could you have I mean, like, it would seem sort of odd to have a door going towards somebody else's property that close. Could,
Yeah.
does it matter? I mean, if you've got an apartment on the side, I don't know.
And that's a really interesting point that, okay, the 5 feet, maybe we allow windows there, but it's a different matter for doors in egress and ingress or whatever. Yeah, I just don't, I'm okay with the 5 feet on each side. I think that's fine. The door issue is of the windows. I mean, I'm sorry, but the door issue is, I hadn't really thought about that. Did we discuss that? We didn't discuss doors, did we?
I don't think we got into that distinction between windows.
Do we need to get in that in depth?
What details you want to provide me for placeholders this evening, and we'll take. But I think I'm hearing right now is it's okay to have windows and doors as long as the walls are at least 5 feet from the property line.
Well, at least windows.
At least windows, yeah, and we need to discuss doors. Or you need to discuss doors.
Well, please discuss doors with us.
Have something to share, please.
You're here.
Talking about, I mean, there can be main doors and then there can be rear doors. There are side doors that aren't like the primary entering. And if there's no, I mean, we don't want to make things worse. So people would be adding a door. Is that making something worse by adding a door to us? So that's technically covered under, you're making something worse if you're putting a door within a non-conforming.
I don't think it is in a strict sense of the structure itself. So just because the structure is there and adding a door and having access all of a sudden to that part of the yard, I don't think makes the structure more non-conforming. But we still have the additional, what we're trying to sort of address is the impact of that structure not having a dwelling unit in it. Now it does. So you can still have, if you feel the need to say no door on the side unless it's at least 10 feet away or whatever metric you want to use. I don't think it makes the structure non.
Although at least temporarily it would be same for windows, really, if you had casements. Right, so you'd open into let's say it's on the 5-foot line, your door or window would open into the setback.
But we've also had allowed limited encroachments for other things, windows that come out, what are those called?
Bay windows.
Thank you, and other things. So I think like a temporary use of a casement window isn't really that much of an impact in my mind.
Yeah, but bay windows are not allowed, right?
Well, with that, we have that also listed down as a placeholder because that was brought up, I believe, by you. And then
Yeah.
we had that section for bay windows that we could add in as well.
Yeah,
If y'all are.
I think windows are fine, 5 feet. I'm not sure I'm good with the door.
How about, I'm
Just
just throwing things out, how
10
about
feet.
no primary entrance door with, unless the structure is more than, let's just say 10 feet. That way you could have an accessory door, the rear door to the kitchen or whatever, but not the primary entrance door where you would expect somebody to come in and out every single time they come in and out and leave the property and come back to the property.
So do we not talk about where the primary entrance door has to be? Like, so it doesn't have to be interior to the lot, opening into the interior
Nothing
of the
so
lot.
far that gets to that specificity.
Except for in alleys. Didn't we say that we just, but no, but
Well, that
we
goes
didn't
down.
talk about that already today? So, yeah, okay.
Unless there's anything else, we're gonna put in a placeholder that says, if it's up against the property line, the rear or side property lines, that you cannot have fenestration. If it's at least 5 feet in, then you can have fenestration, but perhaps not the primary entrance door. Not just perhaps,
Or-
but
or-
not the primary. entrance door.
How about just not doors? Until you get to 10 feet.
Arnie, I'm gonna,
Yeah. I'm good.
what do sample districts have like for non-conforming? Is it different? Because I feel like we're literally creating something out of thin air, out of scratch. Like we're the first people to ever think of this.
From what I recall from our other examples that we pulled from, they did not get down to this level of detail. It was either, it has to be completely conforming, or there was some, or it could be existing. In other words, the non-conformity is the non-conformity and there's no big deal. Let's go ahead and utilize the structure as is. And then I think some of them had some, and it's been a while since I've gone through those, but they definitely don't have the level that we're talking about.
Right. Yeah. I mean, Lexington is a very historic, special place to all of us. So maybe we do need to have a special section. But I think that I'm cool with the placeholders. I just was shocked with like the granularity with which we're discussing this.
Maybe some of that's my fault. I'm just trying to find a way, maybe when we do the review, we find that we don't need quite this much detail in it, or maybe we need more. But
Yeah.
I'm just trying to find a way with some lovely visual aids to get you to a point to put some placeholders in for non-conforming structures.
I think it's actually helpful to have this level of granularity because I think you're going to have people who will be guided by it. And if you don't have that specificity in the ordinance, then there's going to be it's going to be interpreted however the people who are up here, see it at the moment.
I
And-
think as opposed to bigger areas, bigger cities, we have, the exceptions are really stick out because people who need these guidelines, or planning people who need the guidelines. I think it's probably good to have these discussions because we can't just say on or off. I think because the reason we're here is because of everything in between, and there's a lot of in between unexpectedly.
Yeah,
So
yeah. So the placeholders that we have right now are 5 feet from the rear and the side. Is that correct? No, sorry, you can be up against it if you have no
Administration.
fenestrations. And if you are 5 feet from the back and the side, you can have windows and not doors. Is that,
yeah, that's
That's what I think I'm hearing.
kind of a general term.
and then okay. So is that a good enough placeholder?
I think that is for now.
Okay, should we move on?
To your second example that's in your packet, where you have an alley, interior lot again, it's gonna have an alley on the backside.
Okay,
So same question as before. Can the accessory structure that may be modified, converted into an accessory dwelling unit that's detached from the main building, if it's on the property line facing the alley, is that okay?
so we had talked about that was the issue with the door right onto the alley.
Right, can we have that, and somebody could read that for me, where it says no access except for, I think, 5 feet, is that right? Sorry.
Adjacent, yeah.
Somebody else want to,
Oh, but you just said some allowance for ADU reduced rear and or side yard setback when adjacent to an alley. You just said some allow.
some as opposed to. If it's number 5, it says some allowance.
Oh.
So, go ahead.
Oh, I was just saying, I would feel like our standards should be the same, where we no fenestrations and definitely no door, entrance door on the alley lot line.
I guess I don't have a problem with fenestrations because, or not with windows.
Yes.
Doors, yeah, because it's a safety issue for not just the people who are coming out of the house, but people who are driving down the road or the alley. But I'm not so sure that I have a problem with windows there. It's very different if you have that imposed. Do alleys have to be a certain size, or
I do.
are alleys in general like 10 feet wide, or?
I hate, because of the time period that we were developed, I don't think there's a standard size. I think that we're not gonna have too many that are less than 10 feet in width. And we're certainly gonna have some that are a good bit more than 10 feet in width.
So I have
And also, just take into consideration that some of these are gonna have garage doors coming off the alley. So you already have large fenestration coming off the alley potentially.
Although you wouldn't leave a garage door for most dwellings
So really hip and
unless
modern.
you're very arty or something.
Yeah, so an alley, you're right, is providing a natural buffer from any neighbors.
Yeah.
But it's sort of a public road, so there's already examples of like people having residences like right on the sidewalk of a commercial, or, in some commercial areas. And so there's already like precedent that your bedroom window can be right up on a public right of way.
But on a sidewalk as opposed to a street,
Yeah.
right? I mean, that's typically on a
sidewalk leading onto a street. Is that what
Right,
you're saying?
right.
So I guess I'm trying to sort of agree that maybe it's not, there's already a precedent that you can have windows.
Right. So the only concern I would have about windows on the alley would be, again, with the casement windows. So if you've got casements that are opening up on a 10-foot alley, then you have a potentially 2-foot, you're endangering your windows. So I don't know whether that's.
Like, one other thing is, I think that my feeling is the same. So on the back, I think I'm fine with the window, but on the sides, if that were pulled over to, yeah, like that,
Mhm.
I'm not sure that you could have a window on the side. And just like we had said before.
Same.
So we keep the same thing on the interior lot where if it's on the side property line.
Yeah.
Between 0 and 5 feet, you cannot have a window or fenestration,
Uh,
a window.
A window, yeah.
Right.
So we're okay, are we okay with a 0 lot line? So it's all the way up to the back alley property line. And we're okay with fenestration on that back property line,
Windows, not doors.
except for projecting ones, but. What about even a door? Because there were potentially
Yeah.
garage doors there
Yeah.
at one point. Is there much difference between a garage door with a car coming in and out and an entry door?
Well, you've got, an entry door that somebody might choose to prop the screen open,
I
or
would think the architect would perhaps design it so it swings in and then not out.
you would hope.
So is a way to say that no doors are in, it somehow cannot protrude into the public alley?
How to say this play, at some point, there's sort of a Darwinism component. to
Yeah,
that.
Right,
so, yeah, I was
right.
thinking
If you're
that.
gonna do something-
Losing the windows, the doors.
Yeah, windows, your doors, you're in. I'm not sure we can cover quite everything. So in the sort of the scale where we are,
Right.
I think
are we okay with
fenestration on the back
fenestration
is
of
fine.
any type on the back?
On the back, I'm fine with
Alley
that.
access.
Yes.
Windows only if, or I would say windows, because you still have to do doors to talk about on the sides if they're within 5 feet. Well, I could say windows, yes, but I'm not
Picking
sure
up
about
the 5 feet from the previous discussion for sides.
Yes.
So that brick comes forward, but the allowance with the rear lot line for the alley is fenestration is allowed.
Mhm.
Right. Does that
Okay.
work?
So,
Okay.
Arnie, the only other thing that which goes into definitions is what's an alley?
Uh-huh.
Have a great map that says these are the main streets, these are the arterials, these are the collectors, these are the regular streets, and these are the alleys. So that's gonna be up to the zoning administrator
Okay.
to determine.
Yeah,
And-
because in our case, we have between our house and the next house, there's an 8-foot easement that is not an alley, but you access the garage by it. So I could come to you and say, well, this is a public, between these two property lines, this is how we access it.
The easement, sorry for interrupting, but the easement isn't an alley. It's not a separate piece of property. So
Okay.
that would be my distinction. I'm not
Okay.
gonna go look for easements. And even if you came to me with the easement for your neighbor to come across your property, that's an easement and not a separate deeded piece of property that is either public or private. And sometimes we can't tell which it is.
Okay, no, I remember that actually, on first time I met you was with this question. Because between our two houses, it's not an easement, it's actually, the question is, that we don't even know who it belongs to because each lot is contributing 8 feet or something, 4 feet to it. So in a way that I'm just trying to make the distinction because we may have more of those in Lexington. But we also have the ones that are very clearly public alleys.
Right.
We're gonna have some odd situations. If you think about the 100 block of Taylor Street, where the Taylor Street, the house faces on Taylor, but then it backs up to Spotswood. That's not an
Right.
alley. I'm gonna say that that's a main road, and some of this isn't gonna be applicable to that.
Right.
We are gonna have some fairly obvious alleys.
Okay, that's all. Just.
The last one that we have prepared for you is corner lots. I should have picked something over in Providence Hill simply because everything there is sort of on a bias and it was really hard to blow this up. So this one looks a little bit funky. In this example, which is also in your packet or in your appendices or appendix there, because the way we have the definition for corner lots, the narrower frontage is the front yard. So here along Sunset, you have a 25-foot front yard setback, 15 feet for the other street corner, which is on Providence. And then we need to determine where there's an allowance for the accessory building that could possibly be an accessory dwelling.
So you saying, I mean, my position on this. I don't know where everybody else is, but is that you still the same thing? If you're up on the is that the property line? No.
Yeah.
Here. If you're on the property line, no windows. No doors. And otherwise, I mean, if it's already there, I would actually just say the same numbers. I mean, does that, so 5 feet, 10 feet for a door, 5 feet for windows, 10 feet for door?
I think, I don't know, if there's any examples of this in Lexington where that hypothetical structure is like on the street, the corner side of the street and not the interior side of the lot.
Hmm.
That's what I was gonna get to first, to see if we couldn't work on the rear yard, and
Okay.
the side is not adjacent to a street. And then discuss what if it's over here, close to the other street. So does it sound like we want to follow the same for the interior lots with respect to the 5 foot, no fenestration up, and a door, not until we get to 10 feet in? Provide some consistency.
That sounds reasonable to me.
Okay, then if it's over on the other street, so not the front street, but the side street, and again, we define our corner lots based on frontage. So the frontage, that the smaller frontage is your front. And then the other one is the longer side. And don't ask me what we do when they're absolutely equal, then it's a little bit of a toss up. But what type, because it would be reasonable, I think, to assume that on the other street that is not your front, that you might have a garage there already on the property line.
Mhm.
And do we treat it the same way that we treated the alley just a moment ago in our other example?
Well, certainly you would treat the property line that's up against an abutting property the same with no windows.
Yeah.
And 5 feet for a window, 10 feet for a door.
Coming from the back side, from this side.
Yes, from this side, not the street side, but so same, when you're talking about another property owner, but when you're talking about the street,
You should just chosen a house, a couple, the big house on the hill of Junkin, there's a big accessory garage. That's built right there on the corner of Junkin and Sunset. Anyways, point is, but that's not right on the lot line. I just know that,
Yeah, it said it. a little bit.
yeah. But that's not an accessory dwelling unit. That's a garage, 2-story garage. Could be.
Yeah.
Yes.
So do you want to treat the side street the same that we treated the alleyway
Alley,
in the
yes.
previous example?
Yeah.
Yes,
And then bring it back to you, most of you, for the next
Uh-huh.
time that we talk about this?
yes.
that
Yes.
seems reasonable to me too. Anybody else?
Then my only question, another question this is brought up is access to the accessory dwelling.
You
I
mean
don't
like
think-
where's the front door?
Well, no, how do you get to it? Do you need, and do you need any direct access to it? Across the lot? I don't know why it just struck
So-
me that we've been talking about placing it in interior in this corner and that corner. And then are there any requirements about how you get to it? And maybe not. Usually not. I mean, if somebody decides that you're going to walk across the grass to get to your front door, that's okay. Yeah, okay, never mind.
It could just be a design issue again on how
Right.
that gets treated per the lot, what's already on the lot.
Yeah.
Sort of along the same lines, I don't have an answer for you, but there were questions about addressing, how is it going to be addressed if it's towards the rear, and I've
Mm.
reached out, but our 911 addressing person is on vacation, so I don't have an answer for you if it gets the same address as the main street, or if it picks up the address of the alley, or how that gets how that's determined for 911 purposes.
Okay.
Hopefully I'll have that at the next.
John, are you talking about access for the person or I'm thinking driving it?
Both, but initially I'm thinking of the person. Is there a sidewalk or any requirement? And we're not specifying that.
Uh-huh.
Then the question is, then there's the other one is parking, but parking could be anywhere on the lot. Right? Doesn't
And
have
don't
to
we
be-
have a section that talks about parking?
We do.
Access, I mean, a driveway to get to this,
Well, that's not
Additional
required, I
building.
don't think.
That,
this access.
that came to mind, Gladys, but
Yeah.
I'm not, I'm, s-
So for a primary dwelling house, do you have to have some sort of access from the street? So there's no requirement that you have to have a sidewalk or a walkway from the street to the house.
Lots have to front on a street and that's it. And I'm not aware of anything in building code that says anything about you have to take the shortest distance and or provide a walk of
Mhm.
some impervious hard wearing surface or anything.
and what about fire truck access? So going back to Gladys's expansion of my question.
These residential lots, they're gonna park on the front main street for the most part, and the hose is gonna access most of our small lots. Now, some of the bigger lots, Providence Hill, they can just drive, across parts of the yard if it's not heavily landscaped. So I'm not so sure that the fire truck or fire scrubbing being able to have access and scrub the side of a building are necessarily for us to be concerned about at this point. We will certainly have the building official and the fire marshal take a look at this once we get through a draft to see where there are any red flags and where we may need to make some adjustments.
If a dwelling doesn't have any driveway or off of it and they're parking on the street only, then they want to build one. What are the,
Not so much for I guess for the drive, but we have the parking provisions in there, at least as a placeholder. And we had, I think, two different examples. And I don't think we've chosen one or the other, but I remember one of the examples says, if you have no parking spaces there now and you're going to add an accessory, then you have to put in one parking space. If you had up to two parking spaces, then you have to at least keep those and not make the situation any worse. So we do have some provision already in here for parking, and we'll just have to go back through and analyze that.
but if there is none, right? There's no access from onto the property from the street. There's none whatsoever. What are the rules right now for if I want to build a driveway? Are there any? I mean,
There aren't any other than if you're doing a curb cut, like you're actually cutting the curb to put your
Right.
driveway in onto your property, then you have to contact Public Works. And I can't remember if they actually do the curb cut or if they give the contractor standards to do the curb cut. But there's curb cut standards and apron standards and sort of radius and to get in. But there's no zoning requirement. This is thou shalt have a driveway access onto your property. And I would again refer us back when we get back to the parking standards to see what parking standards need to be put in place. And we were providing some allowance that if you didn't have any parking at all and it was okay as far as me going out and taking a look at the area to see if there's a lot of parking on the street or not. So I would just ask that we put it sort of a pin in it and then come back to that when we review the entire draft ordinance to make sure that our parking standards are where we think we want them. And then maybe if we need to add anything about access and driveways, we would put it in there. Now gets us to 6:30. Do we want to stop with this portion of the discussion? Because that's all I really had as far as presentation materials. We do have number 6, bigger setbacks to the road than to the alley. And there's an Arlington example, and I have to dig that out to even find that. Or are we okay?
Is that not that corner lot example?
Yeah, it could be. I'm not sure why at the moment why I had a number 4 for corner lots and why I had a number 6 that.
Can we leave what we decided for the corner lots as a placeholder for number 6?
Yeah, and that may have been
That
my
makes
example
sense.
for the Taylor Street property and then having the rear lot not the rear access not being an alleyway, but being a Spotswood Drive. But yeah, we can just put a placeholder there and
Feel like 8 feels like something we've already sort of hit 8 a lot with talking about windows and things like that with encroachments.
True, in the sense that maybe we strike that because we know between 0 and 5 feet there aren't going to be any windows, and a bay window only really occurs if it's more than 5 feet in.
So if you have a bay window, if you are at 5 feet, 1 inch in, and you put in a bay window,
Right now, I would say no, based on the placeholders that we have in place, that no fenestration. And that would qualify because it's somewhere between 0 and 5.
so if the bay window would extend into that 0 to 5, then that's a no-go.
If you set back the wall at 7 feet and the bay window extended 2 feet,
Yep.
then you're fine.
Yep.
But once it gets into that setback of 0 to 5, then it's not.
Can we just say, can we make that clear? That what Arnie just said?
We can work on that, certainly.
Yeah.
And because it could be as easily in the above examples, no fenestration, including bay window encroachments.
That, yep. And how about maximum height?
Okay. Maximum height is similar to what we have in the maximum height for detached accessory dwelling units, which is 25 feet or 1.5 stories in height. So if you had a 2-story structure, a true 2-story structure, would that prohibit accessory dwelling unit going in?
And this is an existing
Correct.
2-story.
Still talking about existing structures.
I don't know that I have that. If it's already there, I'm not sure it matters. Like having it, like if you had an accessory dwelling unit on the 2nd floor,
Is 1.5 a consistent metric that they're all 1.5 stories are created equal? Like, I mean, or does floor height matter? Or
No, I'm pretty sure we have a definition. I hope we have a definition.
what, and I know we talked about this and I know we talked a lot about it when we were talking about garages, but like people don't want a 2nd story on top of a garage that would make a structure 2 stories, but 1.5 is good for an existing non-conforming.
right? But if it's already 2 stories for whatever reason,
Then that wouldn't work because we are already saying maximum height would still be not exceed 1.5 stories height.
That's stuff that is in, oh, I lost it. In italics is what I put in. So right now, that's just a proposal or a placeholder. It doesn't have to be 1.5 story.
Yeah.
And the whole, that's just sort of mirroring what you already have. So the question is, if it's taller than that, are you okay? Or would you like to limit it to the 1.5 story or 25 feet in height, which is what a new accessory dwelling unit would be limited to?
So what would 25 feet or 1.5 stories allow? That, no, could I keep my car could I keep the garage and add a habitable accessory dwelling on top of that?
If it's a half, as written, if it's a half story, and the definition that we have in the zoning ordinance of a half story is a space under a sloping roof, which has the line of intersection of roof decking and wall face not more than 3 feet above the top floor level, in which space not more than 2/3 of the floor area and the ceiling next above it.
so that's
Yeah, right.
like
What does
this,
that mean?
right?
If you think of a Cape Cod house, upstairs, the knee wall is no more than 3 feet, and then
Right.
the thing has to slope in.
Yeah.
So you
And-
can't
and
have
it
like a
has to-
5-foot knee wall and then. So that's what we currently have for definition of half story. And then the other half, I didn't quite understand.
But if this is an already existing structure that's 2 feet, 2 stories high. I'm not sure that it makes it, so. Could it be a 2-story ADU, like the ADU is on 2 floors? Or would the ADU, I mean, does that matter?
So far, it hasn't mattered. No, I don't think I don't think we have any provision or prohibition against that. I think what you would commonly find is maybe a garage that's 1 story, and let's say that the setbacks are fine, and they want to add another story to it for the unit. Or we find a building that has 2 full stories, not a story and a half, but 2 full stories, and they want to keep the garage in the lower portion of that and then just add the accessory dwelling unit above. Is that okay? Or if it's not as wide of a building, maybe it's a single car garage, can you then pack the accessory dwelling unit into both levels?
Does anybody have any?
Well, just
Thoughts?
to go back to something that Arnie said, so if we're building a new accessory dwelling unit, our building height is 25 or 1.5. That one?
Correct. I pulled that from the earlier section. Yes. Which is E2 on the previous page.
And do we have very many situations where we have a 2-story garage, say?
Yeah, and is the height more important than the stories?
Yeah, that's-
Or is it the square footage that's we're talking about? Like, we obviously have it, we already have a square footage
Mhm.
sort of
Max.
guideline.
Lurking.
I'm just curious, like, is the appetite to create a 1.5 story cap because it's unsightly to have a 2nd story dwelling, or is it just that's just going to make it to push things too high?
Except that it's already there.
Right. So that's what I'm saying. What's the appetite for like somebody not living up there?
I don't see an issue with it myself. If
Would
it's already
there-
there.
Would a sort of compromise be that it shall be no more, this existing structure shall be, as long as it's no more than 25 feet in height, nor 2 stories in height? So that gets you away from, if
And-
it's 2 stories existing.
Why don't we just say 25 feet? Why do we have to get into stories?
True. Do you mind, Lee?
Can you talk to them?
And state your name and address.
Lee Merrill, 202, #2 Randolph Street. The 2-story, this, if we're talking about the non-conforming existing buildings, right?
Mhm.
There are all sorts of knee wall buildings in this town that are 4 or 5 feet at the E before they raftered them up. There's gambrel shapes. So I think that you're on the right track with the 2 stories. And as far as limiting the height, I even find the 25 feet to be completely arbitrary. If I was designing a steeper roof and it ended up at 27, you'd be arguing for 27. So I think you're on the right track to, if you're gonna try and limit the height of these things, think about the context of light and ventilation, the effects on the neighbors, et cetera. And in terms of the flexibility that you're trying to create here to allow the conversion of a lot of existing stock into another use, please don't overly restrict the height and or the height of the eaves or the knee walls, which is what I think that definition just scared me, because I regularly design 4 and 5 foot knee walls before I rafter up to get a smaller shape or volume, but useful living.
Right.
The difference
Yeah.
is what Lee was talking about, I think, is designing, building something new as opposed to where I thought we were talking about an existing structure.
Talking about non-conforming.
So so I think while I understand that you're not allowed to go, I think what we're saying is you're not allowed to go into an existing structure and change the roof to put a whole new floor on the next building. You have to get, it's the existing structure as a height where it's not conforming. Yeah, so and I think the existing height is the existing height where it's not conforming. I think that's, doesn't have to be 25 feet. It can just be whatever's there as it is right now.
Yeah.
But you can't build anything new that's more than 25 feet. Is that?
Because you're making it worse. You're making
Right.
it more and non-conforming. Because it's
Yeah, but yeah, you can't, if
it's
it's,
extending and enlarging.
so the 25 feet, I think is, is that in there because you wanted consistent with new building or?
It was just brought forward as sort of an idea to consider. It doesn't have to be the same 1.5 story and 25 feet for the new accessory dwelling units, because that's what we put in for the new builds. You certainly have the flexibility to put something else here, such as whatever the height of the structure is.
It is, yeah, I just say, just case by case example, you can't raise it, you have to use, you can lower the height if you want to, but you can't make it bigger.
The other thing to keep in mind is also in R1 and R2, our maximum heights are 35 feet. And you can go up to 45 feet if you have additional side yards. So just to throw that out there, just as far as what our height limits are.
That's,
But these are still
fair.
existing
Yep.
structures that have already been approved or well, that have already been approved, we hope.
Correct.
So we could, one option would be to remove number 7 entirely and not have a maximum height and just, since we're talking about, or say that it
No
can't,
maximum height.
I'm sorry.
I would prefer to have something there so that it's clear
so-
when somebody's asking the question, when they're designing, what is the height? No maximum height.
But this is not designing, right? This is what's already
Well,
there.
when they're considering what they're going to do with that existing thing, that kind of design, not new design, but
Okay.
can
So-
they put it into a building that's 27 feet? Can they put it into something? So I'd rather,
I guess, can you say no maximum height, but is this where we would say, but you can't increase the height while as you're retrofitting this to be a dwelling? Like, I don't know, you can't like add extra height to the roof line or add a chimney or add a,
why don't we just say maximum height is determined by the existing height of the structure? Or just say that instead of, because that's kind of what we're trying to do, right?
how about we
Only
put,
talking the non-conforming, right?
Right.
So-
right, but I mean, non-conforming, like, yeah, you're not increasing the square footage of its footprint. But you can, if it's a non-conforming lot, can you build up? Like, is what?
you have a lot of height allowance already in there. So as an example, if it's more than 35, I cannot think of any accessory structure that's more than 35 feet in height. But if we had one that was 40 feet in height, then as we're talking, it sounds like you could go ahead and put the accessory dwelling unit into it because we're not going to have a height maximum. But you could not make that 40 feet to 45 feet or anything else because that's the non-conforming. You can't make that worse.
Right, so yeah, I do think though that, yeah, that you can convert a non-conforming garage that is now on the lot line or 5 feet from the lot line, and then now you could potentially, if we say no maximum height, then literally they could build. They could make
But
it as
doesn't,
tall as they want. I mean, as tall as, I guess still what's in the
We also sometimes have in some of these nonconformities, it's not conforming, but you can expand it up to 10% of the floor area. So it gives you some allowance sometimes in certain situations, not like across the board. And I'm not sure if it's valuable in putting something in the height that it is what it is as far as height goes, and it cannot be expanded more than an extra 5 feet in height or 10 feet.
I'm leaning
or-
towards like, it is what it is, but you just can't go upward.
Okay.
But,
Right.
or something like that, because
yeah,
Unless
so
it's
what Matt said,
approved
right?
in a conditional use permit. Unless there's some justification for it and maybe it makes sense in that particular case, but it's going to be through the conditional use permit. Does that make any sense?
Yes.
That, no.
Are we saying, okay, if this non-conforming is now 40 feet, we're gonna just let them stay, that they can't go any more than that, but they'll stay at 40. If it's only 20 feet, or if that's possible, 20 feet, what's the maximum then they can go up?
35 feet according to
35,
what the code
okay.
says.
All right.
But it kind of depends on where it is. If it's between 0, if it's on the lot line, then they're not going any higher than what they already have in that 0 to 5 feet, or if it's in the side, the 0 to 10 feet, that's not getting any bigger. But we have a fairly high allowance for height. So not in the encroachments and the setbacks, but the rest of it can go up to 35 feet and even more if you have enough setbacks, side setbacks.
So in other words, making it worse or more non-conforming does not include height. So if it's up on the property line and I'm not considering changing it into an ADU, let's say I have a garage, it's on my lot line, it's currently 25 feet and I want it to be 35 feet, but still be a garage with storage, a lot of storage above. I could do that even though it's a non-conforming use.
I think I'll use my example from previously. Hopefully that'll answer the question in the sense that if it's 40 feet along 40 feet of the property line, you are in for 1 story into that rear yard setback. That's okay. And even if you completely demolished it, you could build it back 40 feet along the setback up to the property line. We would allow that. But you couldn't put the second story on also between 0 and 5 feet because that is the new volume that wasn't there. So you grandfather for what you had, but the new thing has to comply.
So the height would it for a non-conforming use, let's say it's one of these garages, they couldn't actually raise the roof line, is what I'm sort of hearing.
That's
Between what that portion that's in the setback, correct? And what we're rarely going to have is a nonconformity based on height and based on height alone.
Yeah.
So that's, I can't think of anything that would be above 35 feet, which is quite tall.
Yeah.
For an accessory structure.
So it sounds like maybe limiting it, like Matt and Blake, our soon to be not commissioners, are proposing to not allow expanding the height.
Yeah.
Is that?
I
I'm all
think
right.
that's right. I mean, because if it's non-conforming, then yeah, I'm thinking it's interesting because I was thinking more non-conforming because it's on the property line.
Right.
And that's where what we're paying attention to. The height is just, it is what it is. I don't think you can, because it's new construction if you start raising the roof.
Right.
And that doesn't make sense. That we would allow that.
So then maximum height is the existing height.
Yep.
We've only got one more item in this. Do we have time?
Sure. It's all up to you.
Just what?
Does that work for you all?
Yeah.
To do one more and then,
Sure,
Be
we
done
should
with
go
that.
out strong with our 2 commissions.
Savoring.
okay, number 9.
This is a really maybe convoluted way of getting to the discussion that we had about gazebos. And I was also thinking, well, what else is like a gazebo? And that's a carport with just posts and no interior walls. So that was the discussion that we had previously is a gazebo enough of a structure to sort of hold a nonconformity? So we were trying to figure out whether or not walls could be put in between the posts in those situations or not. So already in the definite or in the upper portion for number 9, there was this odd wording that I added in with the exception of gazebos to perhaps address that issue. And then another potential is number 9, where a post and beam structure, and again, for me, that's gazebos and carports, anything that has posts,
Mhm.
some sort of structure that holds up the roof, but maybe no complete sidewalls to them, just the posts and nothing in between.
And posts that are sunk into the ground, like a
Presumably.
foundation.
But you could have them potentially, if it's a slab, then they could be bolted to the slab.
Yeah.
Okay.
Minor difference, but still posts.
Okay.
So a post and beam structure, such as a carport that is located within a yard setback, may have exterior walls infilled between the posts and still comply with this section, provided all other standards found in this section can be met.
Would that comply with all applicable building code regulations? Because that's what I'm saying. Like, I don't think that a carport that's bolted down
Mhm.
is like suitable for
not a carport, like a metal carport that may have a couple little screw anchors in the ground. No, but if you had a post and beam carport that's old and rickety, but it's there and it's in the setback, we're generous in that we will allow you basically to tear that thing down and build back in that same footprint, particularly paying attention to what the nonconformity is.
Yeah.
We had a longer discussion about gazebos. How do we deal with gazebos? How do we address those? Is that enough of a structure that it attains the status that it's a nonconformity and can be converted into accessory dwelling, or is it not? So this number, again, the initial language there that accepts gazebos, or this number 9, it may be a little bit awkward, and I'm not saying it's maybe the best way to deal with it, but just giving you an option of stating that these post and beam structures can be infilled to act as a structure worthy of an accessory dwelling unit, provided they have to meet building codes, and because that's
Yeah.
a given.
Okay. Sorry, you just rocked my brain when you said that you could tear down the existing structure and build a brand new structure right on top of the same footprint. Is that what you're saying we can do with any of these non-conforming? Is that you can just take, well, there was already a garage there, and now we're just going to raise the garage and just now just do new construction on that original footprint.
That's it, yeah.
Is that a workaround for all of this?
No, I don't think it is. I'll use again the example where you have a garage or something that's in the setback, however many feet it's in the setback for one story. Our code is not so specific that in some other codes say, well, you have to keep that wall that's in the setback, that rear wall that's 40 feet long for the garage or whatever the structure happens to be. You have to keep some portion of that wall. So sometimes you'll see structures that are torn down and they have this rickety wall just supported in some way because they have to keep that because that's the non-conforming and they can't knock that part down. We don't have that sort of, I call it a little bit of a game in the sense that, okay, you got to keep one wall up and you got to keep at least 75% of the framing members in that wall. Otherwise it's a new wall. We just say, if you can show us that for 40 feet, it was an encroachment, 1 story in height, this far into the setback, we will let you demolish that and build that new thing 40 feet into that setback for that 1 story in height. But what's different here, that's just sort of a replacement. We're talking about the use, the accessory dwelling. That's what's making this different than just a straight replacement of whatever it was.
So if somebody, let's say we passed this and then somebody tears down their garage and builds up a garage again. And then it's an existing, but it's still an existing use, right? I mean, it's there. And it is still a non-conforming building. So they build it back as a garage. And then a year later, they decide, well, I actually want to put in a unit, an ADU. Then they have gamed the system. Is that correct?
In what way? Because the structure was there, they just put a newer structure back in the exact same place as the old one. So it's, in my mind, it's no different than if they had left the old structure and they came back and they put the accessory dwelling in it, or they come back a year later and put the accessory dwelling unit in the new structure that's in the same place as the old structure. So I'm not sure what they've gained by doing that.
Can you get a building permit if it's non-conforming though? Like if you're just, you can't. You have a non-conforming garage, that's a garage, it's not an accessory dwelling, it's just because it's right on the lot line. You can't just tear it down and build something back up in its place, right? Because that would require building permits, which would then go to you and you would say, no, that's non-conforming.
Except you're rebuilding the same thing.
Yeah.
Oh.
So that's the interpretation
Okay.
that, because we do not have specific language that says the new that you have to keep up sometimes they say 75% of the wall has to remain, and you prop it up in some weird way and then you build the new structure around the wall and it's just a funky. thing. It's not easy either for the contractors.
Yeah.
My interpretation is you can tear that thing down and build it right back in the same spot. There's no loss. I mean, that impact was already there. It's just a newer thing that's in that same location.
This is blowing my mind in the same way that it's blowing Blake's, because this seems to undo all the stuff we had been talking, a lot of the stuff we've already been talking about, right?
Yeah, doesn't-
Except that you can already do this,
Yeah.
correct? So
You've always been able to just, as long as it's already there, you can just build right on top of it if you're not
Making it
not
worse.
encroaching on and making the nonconformity worse.
So if we're talking about, when we are talking about the height, for example, and we put in, it could just be the height of the existing structure. Then somebody can come in and build a whole, which is, I think what someone was saying, build a whole new structure. That's at that height. Is that correct? And so it could be, let's say you have a building that's 40 feet tall and it's non-conforming because it's a garage that's just on the property line. You could, in theory, come in and just tear that whole garage down and build a nice little structure that's 40 feet tall. And
But it's no
Yeah.
different than
And
the
that's
old
not-
structure. We haven't, you don't automatically get to put the ADU in it unless you meet all the requirements that we're talking about.
okay.
With
so
a
like
conditional
this.
use permit, with everything else that we've talked about thus far.
So going back to number 9, I guess the only hangup I have is that I wouldn't want, even if it's non-conforming, I wouldn't want there to be a house like that's just built with less design standards and safety standards than like an actual dwelling. Like you always talk about like small homes. You can't have small homes because it's not, the foundation's not the right way. Like, so I wouldn't want somebody to just like fence in or to wall in their little garden gazebo because, and you know, if it doesn't meet building codes because it's non-conforming.
And they will have to get building permits for conversion of anything into in a dwelling unit. So it will have to meet the building codes that are applicable at that time. And if it's a foundation issue, then they're going to have to dig out the post and put in a proper foundation for that unit. So everything that is going to happen still has that backstop of a building code. And this may be just an awkward way. I was just trying to address this gazebo discussion where there were, I think, a couple of you that had this issue that maybe a gazebo isn't enough of a structure, and try to come up with something. Maybe it's not needed. Maybe it's just it's
Yeah,
not needed, and you just assume that anything that's there, if it's a carport or not, it has the ability, as long as it meets building code, to be converted.
can
So,
you,
I-
sorry, go ahead.
sorry, I can go to a big box store and for $1,200, get a post and beam gazebo with cloth sides and screen. Yeah. So to me, that two questions. One, that obviously wouldn't structurally be able to be turned into a ADU. But I do worry that all of a sudden, if people could start converting their gazebos and their gazebos are not in, is it almost like you could put a placeholder in with this gazebo and then convert it to an ADU in the future? That's my concern.
That was the concern from
Yeah.
the last meeting that we talked about ADUs. And that's why I also put on the first part 9, detached non-conforming accessory buildings, with the exception of gazebos existing prior. So maybe that addresses that particular concern. And I can't imagine there are going to be too many people that are going to pay attention to what we're doing now, go out and buy a gazebo or anything else and place it in their setback.
Carports would be more realistic if there's,
You know.
you know.
I would say it's more of an issue with the carport.
Yeah.
But
and
I
some of-
think you're right. You could still do it as a placeholder.
I mean, we've had, I think the one example we've talked about is an example of a carport. Maribai's, I think. Sorry.
That's a half a carport and
Half
half
of
a
it,
structure. It's a,
Non-conforming.
So there's a logic to that because it's integrated into the structure that the existing structure. It's not a free newly placed gazebo in the middle of my yard.
Maybe this is more detailed than is needed, but let's say you did buy a gazebo and you put it in, let's say it's 100 square feet, you put it into your rear yard. And it's only tied down with a couple of little screw anchor things, and that's enough for that structure. But when you convert it, one, is it big enough to convert? And two, when you go for the building permit, then Steve's going to be looking at your foundation. Is it below the frost line? And all those other requirements. A little skinny gazebo post, that may not have enough depth, even if you infilled it for the insulation requirements and all the other things. So it may just not be worthwhile to convert a gazebo just because of the way it was built, or a shed, or any other sort of lightly framed structure.
But you have put in the exception of gazebos are not current, and it, as written here in the blue, with the exception of gazebos. So we're not actually allowing gazebos.
No, but
We're
just
talking about them,
carports.
that's just for me a way to put something in based on the last conversation. Is still up for discussion, obviously.
Right, but number 9 is about
Yeah.
post and beam structures that are not gazebos, correct?
Well, I actually wrote both of those things trying to address this idea of gazebos and then other things that are like a gazebo that it would have infilled walls. So you do unfortunately have two options there when maybe you didn't need two options. So I was trying to craft something that in the post and beam structure that captured both carports that just have posts and then a roof over, and gazebos that are similarly framed.
So are you talking, we need one or the other of those?
It's
Or
up to
can we
you
have
on
both?
how you like them. I think now that more that I read this and I'm trying to explain it, maybe 9 is not needed. And if you're okay with just accepting gazebos out of the first part in number 9, maybe that addresses the concerns about that gazebos as placeholders.
But how does that address a carport?
It doesn't, in the sense that a carport existing to whatever date can be altered.
It can be.
Because the only exception there would be for gazebo and not for a carport.
Okay.
Unless you want to put carports in as a
Well, yeah,
exception as
and
well.
if we're talking about that one specific example, Mirabai's carport, it already has walls, so it's not post and beam.
so there is something we're talking, I mean, maybe an underlying issue or principle here is that, is it a temporary, and I don't know how you define that. So
Mhm.
gazebos are temporary. If I went out and bought a carport, a temporary carport that becomes permanent, it look like sheds, is that, again, it's a placeholder issue.
One other thing to throw out, if you went and got your carport or your gazebo and you put it into your setback, that's not really legal. I mean, if you did it 50 years ago and it happens to be there, fine. But you really can't just game the system by knowing that we're going to have these rules and regulations coming in, because the setback is still a setback for the gazebo or the carport or anything that's a new structure other than a fence and a couple of
Greenhouse,
other.
looking like a greenhouse or
Yeah.
something, or a chicken coop, big
Yeah.
chicken coop.
We have some exceptions to the setback rules that we've talked about, but those are like minimal encroachments into, that's not a chicken coop so the chicken coops have to abide by the accessory structure setbacks. I'm pretty sure that's how we wrote that. So just because you try to game the system and put your gazebo in the setback doesn't mean that that's actually a true nonconformity.
So what if we in number 9 at the top said detached non-conforming accessory buildings with the exception of temporary structures such as gazebos? But I guess some people might feel like gazebos are a permanent structure. I don't know.
Yeah, something like that. I mean, if there's a definition of temporary structure.
Yeah, I mean, there's other things besides gazebos that are temporary structures,
right.
so.
So, but does that get at some of the, we're looking to say you can't put in a temporary structure and have it be a placeholder,
That can become a.
right? For something that will then, be considered an existing non-conforming.
That's why we gotta pass this right now, today, while we're here, so that nobody can go rush out and build a temporary structure.
The move seconded. I also don't think this is going to happen that often. And again, we're talking about structures that are going to exist that are legal non-conforming.
Yeah.
Can't just
that's it,
plop
yeah.
something down in at the property line between now and the adoption date of this ordinance. It's still gonna have to meet the 5 foot in the rear, 10 feet on the side in R1.
Okay, so then we want to add that and take away number 9. Is that?
Yep.
What I'm hearing?
Number 9 was a bit clunky, admittedly.
Ah, it was a good try though. And it got us to talk about it. So. All right. So are we?
If I could just
Yeah,
ask
please.
for one thing, and that's enough for those, for our 2 outgoing members, if you have anything that you want to share, sort of words of wisdom about particular items, or if the direction that we're going, you would just like to see less flexibility, more whatever you want to share, since you have been with this process since we started ADUs.
Well, as soon as I roll off planning commission, my consulting fee will be $100. No, just kidding. No, words of wisdom is that it's now that it's sort of been edited down and matches the formatting of existing things, it looks a lot tighter and cleaner, which is easier to read. And so I do think that it's less unwieldy than it used to be when there was a lot of, other language that finally got taken out. There's a lot of yellow highlights of placeholders and talking about the number of people that are allowed to live in these. And I don't, I feel like we should try to match what other people have, what other just cities and jurisdictions have already sort of created for that, whether they include a cap, a limit or not, as we want to sort of go with the intent and the purpose of this is to make it to be more helpful and less less prohibitive if we're going to be talking about restrictions on how many people can stay in these structures and not. I didn't come into this meeting planning a farewell wisdom, so it's hard for me to speak off the cuff.
But you're welcome to submit later.
Okay.
No fee, of course.
Oh, you're out of it, being a good citizen. I was joking, by the way. No, I'd be happy to continue seeing these draft agendas for the next while this thing's still going on and add any input, but I don't. Yeah.
I have nothing to say. It's just, this is the fun part where you just have to make a decision. That's the worst part of it. There's no right answer.
That's right.
That's right.
Good luck.
Thank you. Okay, does that wrap up this part for us? Okay,
Public comment.
yep. So we will move on to public comment. Is there any public comment on this? Okay. Do we need to vote on closing this section? Okay, so moving on to other business. Zoning and planning report.
Just a quick report with 3 items. We did receive a historic district certificate of appropriateness application for the demolition of a structure at 201 North Randolph Street that will go to the ARB on August 3rd. The building official has also recently encountered a number of unlicensed contractors and wanted me to report to you and the public that he is available for questions and to confirm whether or not the contractor that you're speaking to, whether or not he has the appropriate licenses with the state. So again, that's more of a public announcement or service announcement to make the building official available if you have any concerns or questions about a contractor that you're working with or about to work with. And he can certainly look up their licenses on the DPOR website and see what sort of qualifications they have. There are 3 different licenses for at least some of the commercial, no, the GC. In other words, there's a class C as an example where the project cannot be more than $10,000 dollars for the project cost. So and then they go up to a B, which is another amount. So sometimes we've had problems with class C contractors that are doing more than $10,000 worth of work on a job site. So that again, that's just an announcement. If people have questions about contractors, they are welcome to call Steve and see what license, if any, that contractor has.
May I interrupt you? Just, is that something that you're making an announcement of in the paper or anything?
No, we're not advertising that or haven't put an ad in the paper or any kind of public service announcement. That's something that Steve has encountered recently and
Right.
requested that we just report out. And this is a good avenue for that
Okay.
Could,
because of our wide audience.
well, it also could be something that he puts on the website too. That would
Yeah,
probably be the best place now.
because we don't have very many members of the public here.
I'm
Here
sure there are
tonight.
plenty.
Are they? Oh, excellent.
The last thing to mention is I attended the county's Board of Zoning Appeals meeting last Wednesday to see how they hold their meetings, to see if I could learn anything, and also to a lesser extent to show some support for another zoning administrator.
Excellent.
Okay, how about key annual PC milestones? Nothing? Okay, city council?
Shannon, one thought on that.
Yeah.
As we switch over with you and Pat, I think that 1B we should revisit in this next coming year and say, do we want to change the question we're asking?
How would we address that? Would that be sort of in just in a short period of time? Or are you talking about oh, sorry, I thought you just said over the course of a year. Did I misunderstand you?
No, I meant over in this next coming year. Are those the same questions we want to be asking? And I think it's a question we can discuss with Arnie. What are the key milestones? Do we still want to have these questions, or do we want to change them in the coming year based on any goals that we have or what we're trying to achieve? So it's
Right.
just doesn't have to be today, but it
Sure,
could be an
sure.
agenda item in the future and say, do you still want to keep that? And if you want to keep it, do you want to change any of the questions?
This was something from Jamie. He wanted to sort of keep this on our mind as we go through time, and it could be taken out. It could be amended, however you like to address it.
We added updates recently, though, basically to for planning commission to sort of have a little bit of a heads up if there are going to be big conditional use permits coming up, big site plans coming up, VDOT, WNL. So that's just sort of like the big picture. That was just sort of like get that on your radar so that we're not reading it in the agenda the Friday before.
Yes, excellent.
And I
Yes,
may have,
thanks for
along
reminding
those
us.
same lines, I may have mentioned it before, but we do expect sooner than later a conditional use permit for WNL for a new health center.
Right. We talked
Don't
about
know
that
when that's
last time.
coming
yeah.
in, but they have a deadline, or they would like to start construction in January.
Right.
Yeah, Blake, thank you for mentioning that, because it is important that then it gives us a chance to do some advanced thinking or work or ask for Arnie to give us some background before. It's a little tight sometimes when we get the packet on Friday and have to either have a written response by Tuesday and then do all your research for the meeting. So, yeah, for major projects. So thanks for the reminder. I think maybe the one that in the future we can talk about is the major comp plan review. What does that mean?
Yeah, I definitely would like to know what we're talking about there. Is that the entire comp plan and time frame and whatnot?
Again, if I remember, it was not the entire comp plan. It was the when it was released, there was sort of like those 10 sort of
Projects.
the catalyst projects and the how can, and Jamie was very keen on quantifying results and not just, what are the results of,
Right.
all these aspirations that were in the comp plan? Can we quantify them and can we measure what has been done or what will be getting done? That was, I think, the intent and why it still has been a line item every meeting since then.
That's why I think we just revisit these to say, are they still relevant or do we want to change them? For example, on the comp plan, believe it or not, we're going to be coming up on the 5-year mark before too long.
Right.
So that's going to mean something for planning commission in the near future, within a year or two, year and a half, maybe.
And the idea was that you didn't want to just have to do it all in 5 years. There's more of a gradual approach. We're just paying attention to it along the way. It'll make it easier in 5 years.
Right.
At which point I won't be here.
See, look at all the words,
wait,
look at the
that's-
words.
So it will be
Next
easier
time.
by defense.
Okay, yes, ma'am.
See, we're extracting words of wisdom.
There we go.
No,
As we go. Anything else on other business then? All right, so city council report, obviously Leslie's not here.
She did not submit one to us, so we do not have one for you.
Okay, other than the fact that we will have 2 new commissioners starting 2 weeks, or is it 2 weeks?
Actually,
Sorry.
it's
Yeah.
technically 3 weeks because
Is it
no,
3
wait,
weeks?
July, 2 weeks.
It's
It's
2
not
weeks.
till August that we have 5.
So Mary Stewart Harlow and Jonathan Eastwood will be
Hmm.
taking the place of Blake and Matt. So I guess the next thing then is to express our gratitude to Matt and Blake for your service on the planning commission. It is greatly appreciated by us, by Arnie, by the Lexington city residents, I am sure, who show up and who watch. Does anybody else would anyone else like to?
No,
Well,
thank you
I-
for participating. It was very,
yeah, we're going to miss you. As I say, we can all be replaced, but we're not all missed. And you two will be missed. I mean, Matt was on when I first came on, so I'm on my 6th year and you were chair when I came on. And then Blake, you came on and you both taken us, Matt through the rezoning and then Blake through the comp plan. And that was a learning curve for all of us in doing that. And then for Matt, I always say we're going to miss our resident parliamentarian.
It's
It keeps us
chaos.
straight.
Chaos is about to happen.
And then Blake, you've done a fantastic job of chairing us this last
Yeah.
year. And keeping us focused and the meetings moving. So you're going to be missed.
Oh, I appreciate that all. I appreciate Arnie and Kate and all the previous folks that were on staff and all the, yeah. I think that planning commission is definitely going to be in good shape and yeah, I enjoyed my time on planning commission, so I'm definitely it's bittersweet stepping down.
I was here right during the transition from the old way that the planning commission worked to the very effective and thoughtful way that we do it now. And it has been really satisfying and inspiring and confidence building that we have come this far, this quickly, and done some heavy lifting. So I am very confident, very pleased that we're leaving with this great infrastructure in place. So thank you both for doing that. And
On behalf of staff, thank you for your time, your talents, and your leadership. It's really appreciated.
Yay.
All right. Motion to adjourn.
second,
So,
All in
oh,
favor? Aye.
all in favor.
Aye. Arnie, did you bring the cake? Did you bring the cupcakes?
I believe I left them at Brew Ridge Taps.
Oh, is that where we're going?